The bitter, swirling wind of the Kalmyk steppe did little to cool the fervour in the young man's heart. It was August 1942, and Grenadier Klaus Richter, barely 20 years old, felt the curvature of the earth itself bending toward German victory. He lay on his stomach, the dry soil smelling of dust and distant artillery, his eyes fixed on the heat-shimmering horizon that hid the city of Stalingrad. Every round he fired from his Mauser K98K felt like a punctuation mark in a sentence written by fate. He was not merely a soldier. He was an agent of destiny, a builder of the 1,000-year Reich. The newsreels had shown him the Führer's calm confidence, the newspapers had detailed the enemy's imminent collapse, and the radio had filled his ears with marches that were the very sound of invincibility. America, they were told, was a mongrel nation, a decadent society of jazz, music, and gangsters, rotting from within, its factories crippled by striking workers, and its people too soft to fight. The real war, the war of will and steel, was here, and it was already won. This absolute, unshakable belief, forged in the crucible of state-controlled information, was a weapon as potent as any tank or Stuka. This story, however, is not about the strength of that weapon, but about its catastrophic disintegration. It is about how the German soldiers' carefully constructed fortress of propaganda, designed to withstand bombs and bullets, was ultimately shattered not by a frontal assault, but by the disarming, bewildering, and undeniable reality of a scoop of ice cream. The worldview of men like Grenadier Richter was not an accident. It was an industrial product, manufactured with the same precision as a Messerschmitt engine. The process began in childhood. Günther Horst Beetz, who would later serve in the Wehrmacht, detailed this relentless indoctrination in his memoir, A Soldier of the Reich. He was born not into a country, but into a cause. From the age of 10, he was absorbed into the Jungvolk, the junior branch of the Hitler Youth. He wrote of the experience not as a burden, but as an honor that filled him with purpose. We were taught discipline, camaraderie, and an unshakable faith in Adolf Hitler, Beetz recalled. The individual meant nothing. The Volk meant everything. We sang songs of sacrifice and glory, and we truly believed that we were the generation chosen to cleanse the world of its weaknesses. This was not simple patriotism. It was a complete psychological rewiring. Every institution, from the classroom to the sports field, reinforced the same central tenets: the myth of Aryan supremacy, the treachery of the outside world, and the infallibility of the Führer. By the time Beetz donned his Feldgrau uniform, his mind had been armoured, layer by layer, against doubt. The state had become his parent, the party his church, and propaganda his gospel. This manufactured certainty was not confined to the home front. It was the primary fuel for the frontline soldier. In the summer of 1942, as the Sixth Army clawed its way towards Stalingrad, Lieutenant William Hoffman kept a diary. His entries from this period are a chilling testament to the effectiveness of the propaganda machine. On July 29th, he wrote with absolute conviction, "The Führer knows the right moment for the final blow. We all feel that this moment is not far away. The Russians are not the soldiers they were in 1941. This was not just hope. It was stated as fact. He dismissed enemy resistance as the last gasps of a dying regime, a narrative fed to him and his comrades daily. In August, he noted, "Our superiority in men and material can no longer be doubted." Hoffman's reality was filtered through the lens Goebbels had provided him. Every German advance was proof of destiny. Every Soviet counterattack was an act of desperation. He and his men were fighting an enemy they had been told was subhuman, led by commissars who had to shoot their own troops to make them fight. The concept of a strong, resilient, industrially mighty opponent was not just unlikely, it was unthinkable, a piece of enemy propaganda to be laughed at. This profound and deliberate underestimation of the enemy, particularly the United States, was a cornerstone of their psychological conditioning. The sheer scale of this conditioning effort remains staggering. It was an industry of the mind, a national project of information control overseen by Joseph Goebbels and his Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. The goal was totality. By 1943, over 70% of German households owned a Volksempfänger, the people's receiver, a cheap, state-subsidized radio pre-tuned to official stations, making Hitler's voice a literal piece of furniture in the German home. Newspaper circulation was centralized under the Nazi publishing house, Eher Verlag, which controlled over 82% of the German press by 1944. The Völkischer Beobachter, the official party paper, was required reading. The film industry was completely co-opted, producing over 1,000 feature films during the regime, many of them, like the infamous Judd Seuss, designed to dehumanize enemies and reinforce party ideology. This was not simply censorship, it was the creation of a closed-loop information ecosystem. Every song, every news report, every film, and every poster was a gear in a massive machine designed to produce one single product: unwavering belief. It was a system built to convince millions of men that they were invincible, that their cause was just, and that their enemies were decadent, weak, and on the verge of collapse. This, then, was the German soldier of 1943 and 1944. He was not a simple man with a rifle. He was the end product of a decade of the most intense and pervasive psychological conditioning in modern history. His mind was a fortress, its walls built from the carefully selected bricks of state-approved news, cemented with the mortar of racial ideology, and decorated with the banners of inevitable victory. He believed in his own superiority, in the righteousness of his Führer, and in the inherent weakness of his enemies. He was physically and mentally prepared for violent battle, for hardship, and for a heroic death on the battlefield. The one thing he was not prepared for, the one thing the entire propaganda apparatus could never inoculate him against, was the quiet, profound, and utterly bewildering shock of capture. It was a shock that would not come from the barrel of a gun, but from a world he had been told did not, and could not, possibly exist. For the men of the Deutsches Afrikakorps, the end came not with a bang, but with a shroud of dust and a deafening silence. May 1943, Tunisia. The air over Cape Bon was thick with the grit of a dying army. The sky, once alive with the scream of Stukas, was now ominously empty, save for the contrails of Allied fighters circling like vultures. For weeks, the world for these soldiers had been a shrinking pocket of scorched earth, a hell of dwindling ammunition, empty fuel cans, and the gnawing absence of hope. The propaganda broadcasts still promised a miracle, a new weapon, a counterattack that would drive the Allies back into the sea. But here, on the ground, the only reality was the endless column of half-tracks, trucks, and Kübelwagens, all motionless, their engines cold and silent. The soldiers, the sunburnt, hardened veterans who had once seemed invincible, now simply stood or sat, their faces blank masks of exhaustion and disbelief, waiting for the enemy to come and collect them. The grand narrative of victory or a glorious death had dissolved. In its place was a quiet, humiliating, and deeply confusing administrative procedure: surrender. Even for the most professional and ideologically hardened officers, the completeness of the collapse was a staggering blow. Hans von Luck, a decorated panzer commander in the 21st Panzer Division, chronicled the final, desperate hours in his memoirs. His unit, once the pride of Rommel's army, was reduced to an immobile collection of steel coffins, their tanks useless without fuel. "Our fighting power was nil," he wrote. "The petrol dumps were empty, and the ammunition dumps too. For the first time in this war, I saw signs of disintegration among the German troops." He described receiving the final order to cease fire with a sense of grim finality. The war in Africa was over. Soon after, von Luck was captured by the British. He recalled the moment with the detached analysis of a career soldier, but the underlying shock is palpable. He and his fellow officers were driven to a collection point, passing thousands of their own men, now disarmed and waiting. The British commander, von Luck noted, was perfectly correct. No triumphant behaviour, no abuse. This cold, professional courtesy was itself disorienting. It was not the hate-filled confrontation the propaganda had promised. The greatest shock, however, came when the British handed their high-value prisoners over to the Americans, who would be responsible for their transport and internment. For these men, the war had now entered a new and terrifying dimension. They were to be shipped to the United States, a country they had been taught was a weak, collapsing society, a nation they had held in contempt. The view from the other side of the wire was just as surreal. Famed American war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who had covered the gritty reality of the foot soldier throughout the North African campaign, witnessed the mass surrender firsthand. His dispatches home painted a picture that directly contradicted the myth of the Nazi Superman. He saw not a phalanx of arrogant conquerors, but a river of defeated humanity. "They are young," Pyle wrote of the prisoners. "They are not big men. They are grim and pathetic." He described their faces, not with hatred, but with a kind of weary pity. "They were past the stage of being glad it was over," he observed. "They were just numb." Pyle's reporting captured the profound disconnect between the propaganda image and the human reality. These were not the demonic figures from the newsreels. They were farm boys from Bavaria and factory workers from the Ruhr, boys who looked just like the American GIs guarding them. He noted their bewilderment, their uncertainty, and for many, a visible relief. "Surrender is not a disgrace to them," he explained to his American readers. "They fought as long as they could, and it was over, and they had no feeling of shame." This was the first crack in the psychological armor, the realization that their captors saw them not as ideological monsters, but simply as soldiers on the losing side of a war. The defeat in North Africa was not a failure of German courage or fighting spirit. It was a catastrophic, undeniable failure of German logistics and industry. It was a victory of mathematics. In the final 6 months of the campaign, from November 1942 to May 1943, the Allies landed over 750,000 tons of supplies in North Africa. In stark contrast, the Axis powers, strangled by Allied air and naval superiority, managed to get a mere fraction of that across the Mediterranean. Operation Flax, the Allied air interdiction campaign in April 1943, was brutally effective, shooting down hundreds of German transport planes laden with fuel and men. On one infamous day, the Palm Sunday Massacre, American fighters destroyed nearly 100 German aircraft in a single afternoon. The final tally of the surrender was a number so vast it was difficult to comprehend. Nearly 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. It was a disaster on the scale of Stalingrad, a wound from which the Wehrmacht would never fully recover. For the individual Lanza sitting in the dust, however, these statistics were unknown. He only knew that his rifle was empty, his stomach was emptier, and his leaders had failed him. He had been told he was part of an invincible war machine, but that machine had just been starved into submission by a force whose sheer material power he could not yet begin to imagine. Stripped of his rifle, his helmet, and his unit, the German soldier was now just a man again, but a man adrift in a sea of uncertainty. His entire identity, forged over a decade, had been predicated on being a conqueror, a member of a superior race fighting a righteous war. Now he was a prisoner of war, a number on a tag, a piece of human cargo to be processed and shipped. The certainties of his world had been obliterated in the Tunisian dust. The promises of his Führer were lies. The invincibility of the Wehrmacht was a myth. As he was marched onto a landing craft, the shores of Africa receding behind him, he was sailing not just across an ocean, but into a void. Ahead lay America, the great unknown, the enemy homeland he had been conditioned to see as a cartoon of decadence and decay. The psychological journey was about to begin, and it would prove to be far more perilous than the physical one. The ramp slammed shut with a deafening clang, plunging the hold into a sudden, suffocating darkness. The final sliver of Tunisian sunlight was gone. replaced by the dim glow of a few caged bulbs and the stench of thousands of men packed into a space meant for cargo. This was the belly of an American Liberty ship, a vast, echoing steel cavern that was now a floating prison. For the captured soldiers of the Afrikakorps, the transition was a brutal sensory assault. The air was a cocktail of sea salt, diesel fumes, sweat, and the metallic tang of fear. The constant, deep thrum of the ship's engine vibrated through the floor plates, a ceaseless reminder of their utter powerlessness. These were men who had commanded tanks, aimed artillery, and flown aircraft, men who had been masters of their own violent destinies. Now, they were cargo, indistinguishable from the crates of ammunition or sacks of grain that had filled this space on the voyage over. They were being moved by an invisible, indifferent machine, their fate now in the hands of the enemy they had been trained to underestimate and despise. Life in the hold quickly settled into a monotonous, surreal routine. Georg Gärtner, a sergeant with the Afrikakorps, later described the experience in his memoirs. The initial days were a blur of seasickness and disorientation. But as the voyage progressed, a strange sense of normalcy emerged. The most immediate and consistent shock was the food. After months of meagre, often rotting rations in the final days of the Tunisian campaign, the prisoners were fed American military rations. Gärtner recalled being handed bread that was shockingly white, not the dense, dark rye of German army bread. There was canned meat, fruit, and coffee that was actually brewed, not the ersatz grain substitute they had been drinking for years. This simple, daily act of being fed decently by their captors was profoundly unsettling. It was the first piece of tangible evidence that the propaganda about a starving, collapsing America was a lie. An even deeper, more terrifying irony haunted the voyage. The greatest danger to these German soldiers came not from their American guards, but from their own comrades. Every man in the hold knew that the Atlantic was prowled by German U-boats, hunting Allied shipping. Gärtner wrote of the pervasive, unspoken fear during emergency drills, the chilling realization that a torpedo from a German submarine could send them to the bottom in minutes. The hunter had become the hunted, and the saviors of the Reich were now their most feared predators. This inversion of reality was a powerful psychological blow, a sign that the entire world as they knew it had been turned upside down. The vast, steel holds became incubators for rumor, debate, and anxiety. Arnold Kramer's landmark study, Nazi Prisoners of War in America, compiled the oral histories of hundreds of these men, painting a vivid picture of the atmosphere on the transport ships. With nothing to do for weeks but lie in their bunks, the prisoners talked. Die-hard Nazis insisted that this was all a trick, that they were being taken to America to be tortured or used as slave labor. They warned the others not to trust the American guards or their seemingly kind gestures. More pragmatic soldiers argued that the Americans, being a capitalist society, would simply want to put them to work. Others, already disillusioned by the defeat in Africa, began to quietly wonder if everything they had been told was false. These debates were a microcosm of the psychological war that would later define life in the camps. Adding to the disorientation was the demeanor of their captors. The American guards were often young, barely out of their teens, and viewed their duty with a mixture of boredom and curiosity. They chewed gum, read comic books, and treated the prisoners not with the ideological hatred they expected, but with a casual, almost lazy indifference. A German officer, accustomed to rigid formality, might find himself being addressed by a low-ranking private with a nonchalant, "Hey, you." This lack of overt hostility was more unnerving than open aggression. It suggested a confidence, a sense that the Germans were not a threat to be feared, but a logistical problem to be managed. This entire operation, the transport of over 370,000 enemy prisoners across 3,000 miles of contested ocean, was itself a floating testament to the very industrial power the Nazis had dismissed. The prisoners were crossing the Atlantic in the hull of a miracle, the Liberty ship. These vessels were the product of an industrial philosophy that was completely alien to the German mindset of bespoke, high-quality craftsmanship. They were not elegant or complex, but they were built on an unprecedented scale. At the peak of production in 1943, Henry J. Kaiser's shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship, on average every 4 days. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously assembled from keel laying to launch in just 4 days and 15 hours. Over 2,700 of these functional, mass-produced cargo ships were built during the war. They were the backbone of the Allied supply chain, a bridge of ships that moved millions of tons of material and millions of men. The German prisoners, crammed into the belly of one of these vessels, were living inside the statistical proof of their Führer's fatal miscalculation. Goebbels had painted a picture of American industry as decadent and inefficient. The reality was a relentless, overwhelming tide of steel, a logistical hammer that had first crushed them in Africa and was now casually ferrying them across the sea like cattle. After 2 to 3 weeks at sea, a new rumour would ripple through the hold. Land had been sighted. The men would scramble to any available porthole or be herded up onto the deck for the first time, blinking in the bright Sunday. What they saw was the final, devastating blow to the world they had known. For those whose ships sailed into Hampton Roads, Virginia, they saw a harbour filled with warships and cargo vessels as far as the eye could see, a display of naval power that dwarfed anything they had imagined. For others, the first glimpse was of the New York skyline. They stared in stunned silence at the skyscrapers, the Statue of Liberty, and a city utterly untouched by war. There were no bomb craters, no skeletal ruins, no haggard civilians. There were cars, lights, and a sense of vibrant, unthreatened energy. This was not the weak, decaying nation from the newsreels. This was a continental fortress, a powerhouse of industry and confidence that had been fighting a war on the other side of the world without even breaking a sweat. The long voyage west was over, but the journey into the heart of a bewildering new reality was just beginning. Stepping off the gangplank onto the docks of Newport News, Virginia, was like stepping into another dimension. The German prisoners, blinking in the unfamiliar June sun, were immediately assaulted by a reality that defied all their conditioning. The first shock was the absence of destruction. European ports, from Hamburg to Naples, were skeletal ruins, haunted by the ghosts of sunken ships and bombed-out warehouses. Here there was only bustling, vibrant, almost arrogant order. Massive gantry cranes moved with a quiet efficiency, lifting nets of cargo from the holds of ships. Freshly painted trucks and automobiles, civilian automobiles, rumbled past, their chrome trim glinting in the sunlight. The dock workers themselves were a source of bewilderment. They were not gaunt, hollow-eyed figures worn down by years of war and rationing. They were large, well-fed men in clean work clothes, some of them laughing and smoking as they worked. The air didn't smell of rot and ruin. It smelled of salt, coal smoke, and somewhere, impossibly, roasting coffee. This was not a nation on its knees, crippled by the demands of a world war. This was a nation that seemed utterly untouched by it, a continental fortress operating at full power, and the sight of it was the first crack in the foundation of their entire belief system. The next stage of the journey was the true beginning of their re-education. Herded onto trains, the prisoners braced for the grim conditions of transport they were used to cramped, foul-smelling cattle cars. Instead, they found themselves being seated in Pullman passenger cars, with cushioned seats and windows. Reinhard Pabel, a soldier captured in Italy who documented his experience, described his utter astonishment. The guards, members of the military police, handed out food. It was not the hard, black bread of the Wehrmacht. It was sandwiches made with soft, snow-white bread, something Pabel had not seen in years. With the sandwiches, they were given bottles of Coca-Cola. For most of the Germans, this mythical beverage was something they had only seen in American magazines or heard about in propaganda as a symbol of decadent capitalism. Now, they were drinking it. The fizzy, sweet taste was the taste of another world. We looked at each other in disbelief, Pabel wrote. Was this a trick? Were they fattening us up for slaughter? But the casual, almost bored demeanor of the guards suggested otherwise. They were simply distributing a standard ration. This simple act, a comfortable seat, a good sandwich, a cold drink, was more effective propaganda than any leaflet. It was tangible, edible, undeniable proof that the America they had been taught to despise was a fiction. For days, the train rolled westward, and the windows of the Pullman cars became a movie screen showing a film of unbelievable prosperity. The prisoners stared, hour after hour, at a landscape that was the complete antithesis of their war-torn homeland. They passed through cities and towns that bore no scars of war. There were no anti-aircraft emplacements, no bombed-out buildings, no shell craters. They saw main streets with busy shops, children playing in parks, women hanging laundry on lines behind neat houses. As documented by historian Arnold Kramer through countless interviews, the most powerful image was the farmland. The train crossed a sea of agriculture that seemed to have no end. Mile after mile of cornfields, vast herds of cattle, enormous red barns with towering silos. To men from a continent perpetually obsessed with Lebensraum, living space, and crippled by food shortages, this endless, casual abundance was a profound psychological blow. They saw countless automobiles on the roads, tractors in the fields, and lights blazing in the towns at night, a luxury unheard of in blacked-out Germany. The civilians they saw were not filled with hate. Often, people would stop what they were doing and wave at the passing train, their faces filled with simple curiosity. It was a journey through a nation at peace with itself, a nation whose power was so vast it did not need to hate its enemies. It only needed to process them. This seamless continental movement of hundreds of thousands of prisoners was a quiet, almost invisible demonstration of America's true secret weapon, its logistical and industrial supremacy, symbolized by its railroad. While the German Reichsbahn struggled to move troops and supplies across a war-ravaged Europe on its approximately 42,000 miles of track, the American railroad network was a continental behemoth. In 1944, the United States possessed over 227,000 miles of mainline track, more than the rest of the world combined. This system was the circulatory system of the arsenal of democracy. While moving over 370,000 German POWs from coastal ports to over 500 camps in the interior, a monumental task in itself, the U.S. rail system was simultaneously executing the largest military mobilization in human history. It was moving millions of American soldiers, tens of millions of tons of raw materials to factories, and tens of millions of tons of finished war material back to the ports for shipment overseas. The movement of the German POWs was not a strain on this system. It was a footnote, a side task, handled with routine efficiency. The German soldier had been taught that victory was a matter of will and superior fighting spirit. The silent, powerful locomotives pulling his prison train taught a different lesson. Victory was a matter of steel, oil, and the ability to move more things to more places, faster than the enemy could even comprehend. The journey by rail was far more than simple transportation. It was a rolling, undeniable indoctrination into the reality of American power. No speeches were given, no films were shown, no pamphlets were distributed. The evidence was simply presented, kilometre by kilometre, through the train window. Every untouched town, every vast field, every passing freight train loaded with new tanks or trucks was a nail in the coffin of Goebbels' propaganda. The prisoners had been told they were fighting a decadent, fragile society. They were now travelling through its powerful, invulnerable, and impossibly wealthy heartland. By the time the train finally hissed to a stop in the plains of Oklahoma, the fields of Arkansas, or the forests of Wisconsin, the psychological battle was already half lost. The fortress of the mind, so carefully constructed by the Reich, had been breached, not by force of arms, but by the simple, irrefutable evidence of their own eyes. The train finally shuddered to a halt, the monotonous clatter of wheels on rails replaced by the hissing of air brakes and the barking of commands in English. This was it. The prisoners, stiff and weary from their long journey, were ordered out onto a platform in the middle of nowhere, a flat, sun-baked landscape that stretched to a hazy horizon. They were in Oklahoma, or Mississippi, or Arkansas, names that were just abstract sounds to them. They were marched toward the barbed wire, expecting the grim, familiar architecture of a European prison camp, packed earth, squalid huts, and the ever-present machine gun towers manned by guards with cruel faces. What they saw instead was so profoundly different, so bureaucratically clean, that it was utterly disorienting. Beyond the wire lay not a punishment center, but something that looked like a newly built town. There were rows of identical, tidy wooden barracks, painted a uniform olive drab. There were separate buildings that were clearly mess halls, a post office, even a theater. In the distance, they could see baseball diamonds and soccer fields, their lines neatly marked in the red dirt. The guard towers were there, certainly, but they seemed almost perfunctory, manned by soldiers who looked more bored than menacing. The initial impression was not one of impending doom, but of a strange, almost surreal orderliness. This was not a place designed out of hatred. It was a place designed by an engineer with a blueprint. The most powerful, immediate, and enduring shock came within hours of their arrival, served on a metal tray in the mess hall. For men who had spent years subsisting on dwindling rations of black bread, horsemeat sausage, and ersatz coffee, the first meal in an American POW camp was a revelation that bordered on a religious experience. The United States, as a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention, was legally obligated to provide its prisoners with rations equivalent in quality and quantity to those of its own base troop soldiers. This was not a suggestion, it was a matter of official policy, executed with bureaucratic precision. The daily caloric intake for a German POW often exceeded 3,000 calories, a figure that would have been a fantastical luxury for a German civilian. Suddenly, these men were faced with a daily abundance they could not comprehend. There was white bread, piles of it. There was real butter, fresh milk, and sugar for their coffee. Meat was served almost every day. Diaries and letters from the period are filled with stunned, almost obsessive accounts of the food. One prisoner wrote home, "If this is what they feed their enemies, I cannot imagine how their own people must eat." Another described gaining over 20 pounds in his first 2 months of captivity. This was not a subtle form of propaganda. It was a direct, physiological assault on the core Nazi narrative of a starving, decadent America. Every satisfying meal was a testament to a nation so rich it could afford to feed its captured enemies better than the Reich could feed its own fighting men. Beyond simple sustenance, the camps introduced a concept that was utterly alien to the prisoners' experience of total war, the idea of a consumer economy. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could not be forced to work, but they could volunteer for labor, often on local farms or in camp facilities like the laundry or kitchen. For this, they were paid a wage of 80 cents per day in camp scrip, a special currency that could not be used outside the wire. The true shock was what this scrip could buy. Every camp had a post exchange, or PX, a small store that was a microcosm of the American consumer world. Here, prisoners could walk in and purchase items they had only dreamed of. They could buy Lucky Strike or Camel cigarettes, Hershey's chocolate bars, and Coca-Cola. They could purchase magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post, their pages filled with glossy advertisements for automobiles, refrigerators, and wristwatches, offering a tantalizing window into the civilian life they had been told was collapsing. In many camps, they could even buy beer, Pabst, Blue Ribbon, or Schlitz. This single institution, the PX, fundamentally rewired their identity. They were no longer just soldiers or prisoners. They were workers and consumers. The act of earning money and then choosing how to spend it, even on small luxuries, was a profoundly individualistic experience, a stark contrast to the collectivist, sacrifice-oriented ideology of the Third Reich. It was a quiet but powerful lesson in capitalism. The entire American POW program was a monumental feat of logistics and bureaucracy, a testament to a nation that treated even its enemies as a complex administrative problem to be solved efficiently. At its peak, the system comprised over 150 main camps and 350 smaller branch camps spread across 46 states, housing nearly 380,000 German prisoners. The construction and maintenance of this vast network, all while the nation was fighting a two-front global war, was an industrial achievement in itself. But the true story was in the details, dictated by the strict adherence to the Geneva Convention. Army regulations specified everything: the precise square footage of living space allotted to each man, the number of latrines per barrack, the requirement for regular medical and dental care, and the aforementioned nutritional standards. This was not born of any particular affection for the prisoners. It was, in part, a pragmatic effort to ensure American POWs in Germany received reciprocal treatment, but more deeply, it was a reflection of a system so powerful and resource-rich that it could afford the luxury of fighting a war by the book. It was a demonstration of overwhelming power through administrative correctness. For a German soldier from the Eastern Front, who had witnessed the brutal, often lawless nature of that conflict, this commitment to legal and humanitarian protocol was yet another bewildering sign that he was dealing with an enemy of a completely different nature. Ultimately, life inside the wire was not a punishment, but an immersion in a bubble of American reality. The camp was a meticulously managed environment that systematically dismantled the pillars of Nazi propaganda through daily lived experience. The lie of a starving America was refuted at every meal. The lie of a decadent, inefficient society was refuted by the seamless organization of the camp itself. The lie of a hateful, barbaric enemy was refuted by the professional, often detached conduct of the guards. By providing for the prisoners' needs, food, shelter, health, and even minor luxuries so effortlessly, the US military achieved something far more effective than any re-education lecture. It created a state of profound cognitive dissonance in the minds of its captives. The world inside the wire was so fundamentally different from the one they had been taught to believe in that it forced a critical, and often painful, re-evaluation of everything. The physical prison of the camp was becoming the key that would unlock the mental prison forged by Goebbels. The gate, a simple barrier of wood and barbed wire, was the dividing line between two worlds. Inside was the strange, isolated reality of the camp, a bubble of bureaucratic order and surprising abundance. Outside was America itself, a vast, intimidating, and largely unknown continent. For the thousands of prisoners who volunteered for work details, the short truck ride from the camp to a local farm or factory was a journey of profound revelation. They would rumble down paved roads, a luxury in much of rural Germany, past farmhouses with electricity and telephone lines. They saw endless streams of civilian cars, a sign of incredible private wealth to men from a nation where automobile ownership was a privilege reserved for the elite. They passed through towns where the grocery store windows were piled high with produce, the hardware stores stocked with tools, and the drugstores advertised ice cream and Coca-Cola. For the first time, they were seeing the engine of the society that had captured them, and the sheer, casual, overwhelming power of it was more intimidating than any tank or bomber. This was the arsenal of democracy, not as a slogan on a poster, but as a living, breathing, undeniable reality. The most common form of labor was agricultural, and for the many prisoners who were the sons of German farmers, the experience was a lesson in humility and awe. German agriculture, even in the 1942, was largely a pre-industrial affair, reliant on the power of horses, oxen, and human hands. A German prisoner, set to work on a typical Midwestern farm, would be confronted with a level of mechanization he had never imagined. Oral histories from the period are filled with accounts of young soldiers staring in stunned silence at a John Deere tractor, effortlessly ploughing a field in a single afternoon that would have taken their entire family a week to complete with a horse-drawn plough. They witnessed mechanical harvesters that could cut, thresh, and bag grain in one continuous operation, a task that required scores of laborers back home. They saw one American farmer, often a man in his 40s or 50s, managing a farm of a size that would have constituted an entire village estate in Germany. This was not a difference of degree, it was a difference of kind. It was a direct, visceral refutation of the Nazi blood and soil ideology, which glorified the peasant farmer. Here was a society that had replaced the peasant with the engineer, and the result was an avalanche of food so vast that the nation could feed itself, its armies, its allies, and its enemies without, it seemed, even noticing the effort. For those assigned to work in industry, the shock was even more acute. Prisoners were sent to lumber mills, canning factories, and food processing plants, non-military industries that were still part of the vast American war economy. Here they witnessed the principles of Fordist mass production applied to everyday goods. They saw assembly lines moving with a relentless, hypnotic speed, turning raw materials into finished products with an efficiency that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. One prisoner, who had worked in a German factory, wrote of his amazement at the safety standards, the provision of work gloves and goggles, and the general cleanliness of the workspace, a stark contrast to the often brutal conditions of wartime German industry. Perhaps the most profound shock, however, was the sight of the American workforce. They saw women, Rosie the Riveter in the flesh, operating heavy machinery forklifts, presses, and lathes with a casual competence that shattered a core tenet of Nazi propaganda. Goebbels had portrayed American women as frivolous, decadent socialites. The reality was women who were strong, skilled, and integral to the most powerful industrial machine on earth. The prisoners saw a society that did not hide its women away, but empowered them, doubling its labor force and its productive capacity in the process. This first-hand, anecdotal evidence was the prelude to the final, crushing realization, one that could be expressed in the cold, hard language of numbers. The war, for Germany, was a fundamentally unwinnable equation. In the peak production year of 1944, the United States produced over 96,000 military aircraft. Germany, with its entire economy geared for total war and using slave labor, produced approximately 39,000. In the same year, the United States manufactured over 640,000 military trucks, the vehicles that were the lifeblood of a modern mobile army. Germany produced fewer than 88,000. The ultimate measure of a nation's power, its gross domestic product, told the starkest story of all. In 1944, the GDP of the United States was an estimated $1.5 trillion in modern international dollars. The GDP of Greater Germany was less than half that, around $650 billion. And the United States was doing this while fighting a two-front war thousands of miles from its own shores, with a civilian population that was not starving, but was in fact enjoying a rising standard of living. The German soldier had been taught that victory was a product of will, fanaticism, and superior spirit. The numbers proved that victory was a product of steel, oil, and economic output, and in that contest, Germany had been defeated before the first shot was even fired. The experience of working in the fields and factories of America was the final, devastating hammer blow to the carefully constructed worldview of the German POW. The comforts of the camp had chipped away at the propaganda. The journey across the country had revealed its lies. But this direct, personal encounter with the sheer scale of the American industrial and agricultural machine destroyed it completely. It moved the prisoner's understanding from the personal to the strategic. The realization was no longer just my captors are feeding me well. It became my country cannot possibly win this war. This was not a matter of opinion or ideology. It was a mathematical certainty, as undeniable as the tractor in the field or the bomber rolling off the assembly line. This dreadful knowledge, this certainty of their nation's impending and total defeat, would seep into the barracks and the mess halls, precipitating a profound psychological crisis that would tear the prisoner community apart. The war of arms was over for them. The war for their souls was about to begin. The certainty died in the darkness. In the long, quiet hours after the camp lights were extinguished, the atmosphere in the barracks began to curdle. The easy camaraderie of the early days, born of shared defeat and a common enemy, evaporated, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Men who had shared rations and stories on the long voyage west now lay in their bunks, separated by a gulf of suspicion. The air grew thick with whispered arguments that would die out the moment someone else shifted in their bunk. A whispered doubt about the promised wonder weapons might be met with a hissed threat from the bunk below. A casual remark about the quality of American food could earn a man a cold, unnerving stare at breakfast the next morning. The collective identity of the German soldier was fracturing, breaking apart under the relentless pressure of a reality it was never designed to withstand. An internal civil war, a quiet, vicious struggle for the soul of the German prisoner, had begun. This fracturing was not random. It followed predictable ideological fault lines. Historian Arnold Kramer, in his exhaustive study of the camps, identified three distinct factions that emerged in almost every compound. At one pole were the Überzeugten, the convinced. These were the fanatical, die-hard Nazis, often young officers or NCOs who had been deeply indoctrinated from childhood. For them, every piece of contradictory evidence, the food, the industry, the undamaged cities, was simply a more elaborate form of enemy trickery. They saw it as their sacred duty to maintain ideological discipline, to police the thoughts and words of their fellow prisoners, and to ensure loyalty to a Führer they still believed would achieve a miraculous victory. At the opposite pole were the Konvertiten, the converts. These were the men who had accepted the evidence of their own eyes. They saw the mathematical impossibility of a German victory and began to cooperate, in varying degrees, with the American authorities. They were branded as traitors, turncoats, by the fanatics. And caught in the vast, dangerous middle were the apolitician, the apolitical. This was the silent majority, exhausted, homesick men who were not interested in ideology. They were farmers, factory workers, and fathers who simply wanted to survive their captivity and go home. They tried to keep their heads down, but in the escalating ideological war, neutrality was becoming an impossible position. The American camp authorities were not passive observers of this internal conflict. They initiated a deliberate, if subtly applied, program of re-education designed to break the hold of Nazism. The program's most powerful and shocking tool was visual. Prisoners were assembled in recreation halls, often under the guise of watching a movie, and were instead shown the unedited newsreel footage from the newly liberated concentration camps of Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. The effect was cataclysmic. The initial reaction, as recorded in numerous diaries, was outrage and furious disbelief. Shouts of propaganda, Fälschung, fake, echoed through the halls. These images, the skeletal figures in striped pajamas, the bulldozers pushing mountains of emaciated corpses into mass graves, were so horrific, so far beyond the bounds of civilized comprehension, that they had to be an elaborate, faked production, a piece of Jewish American agitprop. But as the reels unspooled, the sheer, undeniable reality of the footage began to sink in. The camera lingered on German civilian authorities being forced to witness the atrocities. The methodical, bureaucratic nature of the horror became apparent. For many, this was the moment the moral foundation of their entire world collapsed. They had fought for a cause they believed was righteous and honorable. Now they were confronted with the possibility that they had been fighting to protect a regime capable of industrial-scale mass murder. To fill the ideological void created by this shock, the Americans deployed a more intellectual and systematic campaign. A special branch of the Provost Marshal General's office began to secretly identify anti-Nazi prisoners, men with democratic or academic backgrounds, who had been forced into the Wehrmacht. These men were brought together and given a unique task: to publish a national camp newspaper. The result was Times Der Ruf, Times The Call. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Written and edited by Germans, for Germans, it avoided the tone of heavy-handed Allied propaganda. Instead, it subtly introduced democratic ideals, published uncensored news from the collapsing fronts, and featured articles by German literary figures like Thomas Mann, whose books had been burned by the Nazis a decade earlier. Alongside the newspaper, camp libraries were established, deliberately stocked with the great works of German and world literature that had been banned by the Third Reich. Prisoners could now read the works of Erich Maria Remarque, Heinrich Heine, and Jack London. Classes were offered, taught by German prisoners themselves, on subjects like American history, the English language, and the principles of democratic government. The strategy was clear. Do not simply tell the prisoners that Nazism is evil. Instead, show them a compelling, intellectually robust alternative and let them choose. The crisis of faith was now complete. The pillars of the Nazi worldview had been systematically demolished. The myth of American weakness was shattered by industrial reality. The myth of German invincibility was shattered by total defeat. And now, the myth of moral righteousness was being incinerated by the films from the death camps. The ideological ground was crumbling, and the prisoners were being forced to choose a side. The silent, apolitical majority was being squeezed between the two increasingly hostile poles. The Überzeugten, seeing their authority and their entire belief system threatened with extinction, grew more desperate and more violent in their attempts to enforce ideological purity. The Convertiten and the newly disillusioned, backed by the subtle encouragement of the Americans, began to push back. The whispered arguments in the dark of the barracks were no longer enough. The psychological war for control of the German mind in captivity was about to turn hot, transforming the ordered camps into dangerous cauldrons of intimidation, reprisal, and violence. The newspaper rustled, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, tense quiet of the barrack. A prisoner named Schmidt, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, was sitting on his bunk, openly reading the latest issue of Times Der Ruf ***. He was not just reading words on a page, he was committing an act of rebellion. Across the room, a group of younger NCOs stopped their conversation, their heads turning in unison. Their eyes, cold and flat, fixed on Schmidt. It was not a look of simple disapproval, it was a look of predatory assessment, the way a wolf pack watches a straying member of the herd. This was the new reality of camp life. The lines had been drawn. The simple act of reading a newspaper, of engaging with an idea, was now a declaration of allegiance in a silent, brutal civil war. The barbed wire, once the only frontier that mattered, had become irrelevant. The real battlefront was now inside the barracks, a psychological prison yard where a wrong word or a defiant gesture could have lethal consequences. The agents of this new terror were a self-appointed camp Gestapo, an internal police force of fanatical Nazis dedicated to enforcing ideological purity. Declassified American military intelligence reports from the time paint a chilling picture of their methods. Their primary goal was to isolate and terrorize anyone who showed signs of disloyalty cooperating with the Americans, attending re-education classes, or expressing doubt in the final victory of the Reich. They operated a shadow government within the camp, complete with informers who would report on private conversations. Their primary tool of enforcement was the Fame, a secret kangaroo court convened in the dead of night. A prisoner accused of being a traitor would be dragged from his bunk to face a tribunal of fanatics. The trials were a sham, the verdict preordained. Punishments ranged from organized shunning and public humiliation to brutal beatings administered in the darkness of the latrines. The psychological pressure was immense. To be branded a traitor was to be utterly alone, a pariah surrounded by hundreds of your own countrymen who were now your mortal enemies. This shadow war of intimidation and violence inevitably turned deadly. The most infamous case was that of Werner Drexler, a crewman from the submarine U-118. After his capture, Drexler had actively cooperated with US naval intelligence, providing valuable information. In a catastrophic bureaucratic blunder, he was later transferred, his identity unshielded, into a POW camp at Papago Park, Arizona. The camp held a large contingent of veteran U-boat sailors, including some of his former crewmates. His identity was quickly discovered. The camp's Nazi leadership passed a death sentence. On the night of the 12th of March 1944, a mob of prisoners dragged Drexler from his bunk into a shower room. An official U.S. Investigation report later detailed the horrific, methodical nature of the lynching. He was beaten unconscious and then hanged from a ceiling rafter with a clothesline. His death was a message, a brutal and unambiguous warning to every other prisoner in every camp across America. The arm of the party was long, and the punishment for treason was death. The Drexler murder and a growing number of similar violent incidents forced the American authorities to confront the ideological war raging within their camps. Their response was not to engage in a counter-propaganda debate, but to solve the issue as a logistical and administrative problem. An analysis of camp records showed dozens of murders and forced suicides directly attributable to Nazi enforcers. The U.S. Provost Marshal General's office realized that persuasion was impossible as long as the majority of prisoners were being actively terrorized. The solution was drastic, ambitious, and quintessentially American in its scale: the mass segregation of the entire German POW population based on their political ideology. It was a monumental undertaking. A special screening program was initiated, with intelligence officers and secretly recruited anti-Nazi informants vetting tens of thousands of prisoners, classifying them as black for die-hard Nazis, white for proven anti-Nazis, and grey for the apolitical majority. Based on this classification, thousands of prisoners were relocated in a vast, coordinated movement across the Continental Rail network. The most fanatical Nazis, the blacks, were concentrated in a new, high-security facility, Camp Alva, Oklahoma. Conversely, the whites, men who could be trusted to aid the re-education effort, were sent to places like Camp Ruston, Louisiana. This great sorting, this industrial-scale segregation of human belief, was a critical turning point. While conceived as a security measure to prevent further bloodshed, it was, in effect, a strategic masterstroke in the psychological war. By isolating the most virulent and violent apostles of Nazism in their own ideological echo chamber at Camp Alva, the Americans effectively decapitated the leadership of the camp Gestapo across the entire system. They removed the enforcers, the intimidators, and the agents of fear. For the first time, the vast, silent majority of grey prisoners, the farmers, the mechanics, the fathers who just wanted to go home, were no longer looking over their shoulders. The threat of a beating in the night was gone. The fear of being branded a traitor was lifted. A space had been cleared, a psychological vacuum created. In this new, secure environment, the American re-education program could finally begin its work, not as a timid suggestion, but as a full-scale campaign to win the hearts and minds of a defeated army. The atmosphere in the barracks at Camp Ruston, Louisiana, was no longer one of fear, but of quiet contemplation. The ideological storm had passed, its most violent elements siphoned off to the high-security camp in Oklahoma. Here, in the humid southern air, a different kind of war was being waged, a war of ideas fought not with fists and threats, but with chalk and mimeographed handouts. In the mornings, men voluntarily formed orderly lines outside the converted mess halls that now served as classrooms. They carried notebooks and pencils, their faces filled with a cautious, hungry curiosity. The shouted slogans of the Third Reich had been replaced by the quiet murmur of academic discourse. The war for their minds had entered its final, most crucial phase, and the battlefield was a classroom, the weapon of choice, a book. This was the heart of the Special Projects Division, a secret program established by the Provost Marshal General's office with the express purpose of dismantling Nazi ideology and planting the seeds of democratic thought. The curriculum was a masterclass in subtlety. There were no crude anti-Hitler diatribes. Instead, prisoners were offered a suite of courses, presented as voluntary educational opportunities. The core subjects were American history, English language, and principles of democracy. The teaching materials were carefully crafted. In history class, prisoners learned about the American Revolution, not as a simple rebellion, but as a philosophical struggle against tyranny. They studied the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, with its emphasis on individual liberties and the separation of powers. This was the direct intellectual counterpoint to the Times Führerprinzip *, the Nazi leadership principle which demanded absolute obedience and the complete subjugation of the individual to the will of one man. By simply presenting a functional alternative model of society, the American instructors forced the prisoners into a state of critical comparison, allowing them to discover the flaws in their own system on their own terms. The instructors in this ambitious program were not American officers, but the German prisoners themselves, the US. Authorities had carefully screened the population to identify men with academic, legal, or intellectual backgrounds who were known to be anti-Nazi. These men, concentrated in white camps like Ruston and Fort Kearny, were given the resources to teach their own countrymen. Memoirs from these German instructors reveal the immense challenges and profound rewards of this task. They wrote of the initial resistance, the deeply ingrained propaganda that made students stubbornly defend a system even as it collapsed. An instructor might spend hours explaining the concept of a free press, only to be met with the conditioned response that a strong nation needs a single, unified voice. But they also wrote of the breakthroughs, the moments when a student's eyes would light up with understanding. A former Wehrmacht captain, after weeks of studying the federalist system, might suddenly remark, "So, in America, it is possible to disagree with the government and not be a traitor to the country." These small, quiet epiphanies were the true victories in this secret war, the sound of a mind slowly, painfully, liberating itself. The scale of this intellectual retooling operation was staggering, a testament to the American belief in industrial-scale solutions for even the most abstract of problems. This was not a small, boutique experiment. By the end of the war, it is estimated that over 150,000 German prisoners voluntarily enrolled in these re-education courses. The program printed and distributed millions of educational materials, from specially written textbooks on American civics to the countless copies of the camp newspaper, *der Ruf*, which now served as a rolling syllabus of democratic ideas. At the apex of the system were the special democracy schools for the most promising students. Graduates from these intensive programs were flagged, their names sent back to the military government being established in occupied Germany. They were identified as the potential future leaders, the mayors, police chiefs, and civil servants who would be needed to rebuild a shattered nation along democratic lines. This was not just education. It was the deliberate cultivation of a new German leadership, an ideological crop being grown in the fertile soil of American prison camps. The war in the classroom was laying a new intellectual foundation for the prisoners. They were being given the tools to understand not just what had happened to them, but why. They were learning a new vocabulary of freedom, of rights, of self-governance. But an intellectual understanding is a cold and distant thing. It can change a mind, but it does not necessarily change a heart. The final, devastating blow that would irrevocably sever the emotional ties of these men to the Third Reich would not come from an American textbook or a German professor. It would come from much closer to home, delivered in a familiar handwriting on a thin piece of airmail paper, the letters arriving from their wives, mothers, and fathers in a dying, ravaged Germany would provide the final, heartbreaking piece of evidence in the case against the Nazi regime, turning abstract knowledge of defeat into a visceral, personal agony. The mail call was both the most anticipated and the most dreaded moment of the week. A name shouted across the dusty camp yard could mean a lifeline to a world that was becoming a distant memory, or it could mean another week of agonizing silence. For Obergefreiter Heinz Bauer, a former mechanic from Dresden, the sound of his name was a jolt to the system. He pushed his way through the crowd, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The clerk handed him a thin, flimsy airmail envelope, covered in the censor's black marks. It was from his wife, Gisela. He retreated to the quiet of his bunk, his hands trembling so much he could barely open the fragile paper. The letter was a ghost, a physical piece of a home he could no longer clearly picture. And as he began to read his wife's familiar handwriting, the sanitized, orderly world of the POW camp dissolved, replaced by a vision of hell. The letters from the ruined world were not simple reports. They were cries from the abyss. They were written in the spare, exhausted language of survival. As historian Matthias Reis documented, these letters became a devastating counter-narrative to the dying whispers of Goebbels' propaganda. Gisella's letter was typical. "The nights are the worst," she wrote. "The sirens never stop. We live in the cellar now. The city you remember is gone, Heinz. Street Mary's church is a hollowed-out shell. The old market is a field of rubble. Last month the British came, and then the Americans. They call it a Times Feuersturm asterisk, a firestorm. The heat was so intense it melted the asphalt in the streets. Frau Schmidt from next door. She and her children were found in their basement. They were not burned, just shrunken. The air was gone. A wife from Hamburg wrote to her husband in a Texas camp, "There is nothing to eat but turnips. We are so thin. Do not worry for us, but pray for us. Pray the war ends soon, no matter how." A mother from Berlin wrote, "Your brother Klaus's unit has not been heard from in the east. We must assume the worst. The boys being sent to fight now are 16, 15 years old. The city is a nightmare of smoke and ghosts." For Heinz Bauer, sitting on his bunk in a clean, quiet barrack, the words were a physical blow. He had just come from the mess hall, where he had eaten a dinner of beef stew, white bread with butter, and a baked apple for dessert. His stomach was full. He was warm. He was safe. He looked at his hands, which had grown soft from the lack of hard labour, and a wave of nausea and profound, soul-crushing guilt washed over him. His diary entry from that night captured the torment of tens of thousands of his fellow prisoners. "Gisela is living in a hole in the ground, and I am sleeping in a bed with a blanket. She is starving, and I am gaining weight. She is in hell, and I am in a quiet, green corner of America. I am a soldier who cannot protect his family. I am a husband who is useless." What was this all for? We were promised glory and a greater Germany. We were given ashes and shame. Every meal I eat here feels like a betrayal. This was the ultimate cognitive dissonance. The prisoner's own well-being had become a source of acute psychological pain, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the Reich's catastrophic failure and his own powerlessness. The personal tragedies described in these letters were not accidents of war. They were the intended result of a deliberate and systematic strategy of industrial annihilation. The Allied combined bomber offensive was the industrial hammer of the American and British war machines brought to bear directly on the German homeland. From 1943 onwards, the scale of the campaign was unprecedented. In total, the British Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces would drop over 35 million tons of bombs on Germany. The purpose was twofold: to shatter German civilian morale, and more critically, to systematically dismantle the industrial web that sustained the Wehrmacht. Night after night, hundreds and then thousands of Lancaster and Halifax bombers would attack cities. Day after day, fleets of B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, escorted by P-51 Mustangs, would follow. The statistics of destruction are numbing. Over 600,000 German civilians were killed. More than 2.5 million homes were destroyed, leaving nearly 8 million people homeless. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945, which Heinz's wife had described, was a single, horrific event that killed an estimated 25,000 people in one night. This was total war, a conflict not just between armies, but between entire economic and industrial systems, and the German system was being erased from the sky. The letters, arriving day after day, week after week, were the final, irrefutable proof that the war was lost in the most absolute and catastrophic way imaginable. The intellectual re-education in the classrooms had broken the ideological spell of Nazism, but these personal dispatches from home broke the prisoners' hearts. The last emotional tie to the cause was the belief that they had been fighting to protect their homeland and their families. The letters told them that this was the ultimate lie. The regime they had served had not protected Germany, It had led it to an apocalypse of fire and ruin. The propaganda had promised a 1,000-year empire, a nation of prosperity and strength. The reality, scrawled on a piece of paper from a starving wife in a bombed-out cellar, was a nation of rubble and widows. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing left to believe in. All that remained was a deep, desperate yearning to go home, a home that, they now sickeningly understood, might not even exist anymore. The announcement came without fanfare, crackling over the camp's public address system on a grey morning in May 1945. It was a flat, bureaucratic voice, an American officer reading a dispatch from Supreme Headquarters. The German Reich had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. A strange, heavy silence fell over the assembled prisoners. There were no cheers, no shouts of joy. The emotion that washed over them was not triumph, but a profound, hollow, and deeply unsettling quiet. For years their lives had been defined by the singular purpose of the war. Now it was gone. The relief was immense, a physical weight lifting from their shoulders. The killing was finally over. But hot on its heels came a cold, creeping dread. The war was over. But what now? Going home was no longer a simple, joyous concept. It was a question mark, a journey into a black hole of uncertainty. They were about to be repatriated to a country they no longer knew, a homeland that, according to the letters in their pockets, had been turned into a field of ashes. The journey home was a film played in reverse, a horrifying undoing of their first voyage into the West. The train ride from the camps in the American heartland back to the East Coast was a final, parting glimpse of the nation that had defeated them. They rolled once more through the endless, prosperous farmland, past the tidy, untouched towns, and into the bustling, undamaged ports. It was a landscape of surreal peace and power. Then came the transatlantic voyage, this time on crowded, Spartan ships heading east, back to a broken continent. As former Afrikakorps soldier Günther Beetz recalled, the first sign of what awaited them was the sight of the French port of Le Havre. It was a skeletal ruin, a twisted graveyard of sunken ships and bombed-out docks that mirrored the destruction they had left behind in Germany years ago. From Le Havre, they were loaded onto rickety, wheezing freight trains, the cattle cars they had expected on their arrival in America. As the train crossed the border into Germany, a collective, grim silence fell over the men. They stared through the cracks in the carriage walls at their homeland. It was a nightmare. Every city was a hollowed-out skull. Every bridge was a collapsed tangle of steel in a river. The vibrant, powerful nation they had left behind had been replaced by a monochrome landscape of rubble and ruin. The final arrival was the true moment of shock, a homecoming more traumatic than any battle. For a soldier from Hamburg, pulling into the wreckage of his city's central station was a descent into a surreal, alien world. The landmarks of his childhood were gone, replaced by mountains of bricks and twisted girders. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster, rot, and the lingering ghost of smoke. The streets were canyons carved through rubble, and clearing these paths were the Times Trümmerfrauen asterisk, the rubble women. These were the city's mothers, wives, and daughters, their faces grim with determination, forming human chains to pass bricks and debris from hand to hand, slowly, painfully, cleaning their dead city. An oral history from one returning POW captured the dizzying disorientation. I could not find my own street. The sign was gone. The buildings were gone. I had to navigate by counting the piles of rubble where houses used to be. I saw a woman who I thought was my neighbour, but her face was 10 years older, and her eyes were empty. I asked her where the Bauer family lived. She just pointed to a heap of bricks and said, "They were in the cellar, like everyone else." This was the desperate reality, a frantic, heartbreaking search for the living in a city of the dead. This was Stunde Null, 0 hour, the term Germans used to describe the absolute totality of their nation's collapse in 1945. It was not just a military defeat, it was the disintegration of a society. The statistics are a cold eulogy for a nation. In cities like Cologne, Aerial photography showed that over 90% of the city centre had been completely obliterated. Across Germany, the bombing campaigns had created a housing crisis of unimaginable scale, with millions of families living in cellars, ruins, or makeshift shacks. The most brutal irony, however, was the food. While the returned POWs had been weaned off their 3,000-calorie-a-day diet in the American camps, they now entered a world of institutionalized starvation. The official ration for a German civilian in the American occupation zone in late 1945 often fell below 1,500 calories, and in the hunger winter of 1946–47, it would drop even lower. Men who had gained weight in captivity now watched their own children starve. This was the final, bitter lesson of their long journey. In the end, they had been better fed, better housed, and safer as prisoners of their enemy than their own families had been as citizens of the Reich. The returned prisoner of war was now a man adrift, a ghost in his own home. He was physically free, but psychologically isolated, a stranger in a strange land that happened to be his own. The experiences he carried within him, the shock of American abundance, the intellectual awakening in the re-education classes, the sheer scale of the power that had defeated him were incomprehensible to his starving, traumatized countrymen. They saw him as a man who had had it easy in a golden cage while they had endured the firestorm. He was an alien, set apart by a journey that no one else could understand. His hands were soft, his mind was full of strange, democratic ideas, and his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what the world was like outside the ruins. He had been returned to 0 hour, and now, from this absolute nadir of his nation's history, he had to begin the impossible task of rebuilding a life, a family, and a country from nothing. The war was over, but the ruins of Dresden were a battlefield of memory. Heinz Bauer, now 24 but feeling 100, stood on what used to be his street corner. The great iron dome of the Frauenkirche, once the proud heart of the city, was a hollowed-out crater on the skyline. He was home, but he was an exile. The boy who had left this city in 1942, his heart ablaze with visions of glory and the Führer's promises, was dead. That boy had believed in the 1,000-year Reich. He had believed in the inherent weakness of his enemies. He had believed in the righteousness of his cause. This man, standing in the rubble, believed in none of it. He believed in the crushing weight of 96,000 aircraft a year. He believed in the undeniable logic of a John Deere tractor. He believed in the profound, world-altering power of a nation that could afford to give its enemies ice cream. The propaganda had built a fortress around his mind, but the reality he had witnessed had not just breached its walls. It had leveled the entire structure and salted the earth, leaving him with a terrible, clarifying freedom. In the chaotic landscape of post-war Germany, the hundreds of thousands of returned prisoners from American camps were a unique and often misunderstood demographic. They were frequently called, sometimes with a sneer, the Amerikaner. Their countrymen, who had endured the horrors of the bombing and the brutal final battles, saw them as men who had sat out the apocalypse in a golden cage. Yet these men carried a form of invisible capital that would prove invaluable in the coming years. They had seen, firsthand, a different way of organizing a society. A small business owner, trying to rebuild his workshop from the rubble, might recall the efficient layout of a camp PX. A factory foreman, tasked with restarting a production line, would remember the relentless logic of the American assembly lines he had witnessed. A farmer would think back to the mechanized miracles he saw in the Midwest. They had been given a 3-year, unwilling, but deeply immersive education in American efficiency and pragmatism. They had seen a system that worked, and that knowledge, in a nation that had been reduced to absolute zero, was a resource more precious than gold. The most direct and measurable impact came from the graduates of the secret re-education programs. The men who had been carefully cultivated in the democracy schools of camps like Ruston and Kearney were repatriated with a purpose. While the Allies imposed denazification from the top down, these men helped build a democratic culture from the bottom up. A former prisoner named Alfred, who had been an anti-Nazi intellectual identified by the Americans, returned to his Bavarian town and used his new understanding of civic government to help draft a new town charter. Another, a former journalist who had edited a camp newspaper, helped found one of West Germany's first independent post-war newspapers, his editorials informed by a deep appreciation for the free press he had studied in captivity. These were not American puppets. They were Germans who had been given the intellectual tools and the safe space to rediscover their own country's pre-Nazi democratic traditions. They became a crucial part of the human infrastructure of the new Federal Republic of Germany, a quiet, internal force pushing their shattered nation towards stability and the West. The Great German Times, Wirtschaftswunder *, the economic miracle of the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds, is often attributed solely to the infusion of American capital through the Marshall Plan. But the Marshall Plan was just the hardware. It was the fuel and the steel. A crucial part of the software, the operating system, came from the minds of men like the returned POWs. They formed a generation of managers, engineers, civil servants, and entrepreneurs who did not need to be convinced of the merits of the American model of consumer capitalism and mass production. They had already seen it. They had lived inside it. They understood that prosperity was not built on conquest and ideology, but on efficiency, innovation, and a motivated workforce. They were uniquely positioned to act as the transmission belt, adapting American methods to a German context and helping to build the industrial powerhouse that would become the economic engine of a new Europe. They had been captured as soldiers of the Third Reich, but they returned as unwitting missionaries for a new kind of German dream. In the final accounting of the Second World War, the greatest victories are often measured in armies defeated and territories conquered. But the story of the German prisoners in America reveals a different, more profound kind of victory. It suggests that the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of democracy was not the B-17 bomber or the atomic bomb, but the quiet, overwhelming evidence of its own success. It was a victory won not by destroying the enemy, but by showing him a world that was simply, undeniably better. The carefully constructed edifice of Nazi propaganda, a fortress of lies built to withstand any assault, was ultimately not blown apart by high explosives. It was dissolved, slowly, methodically, and irrevocably by the simple, disarming, and world-changing truth of a Hershey's bar, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and a scoop of ice cream.